I am Alva Taylor here at the Center for Digital Strategies at Tuck, and we're pleased to have Nicholas Carr, who has written several books, very highly regarded books, and in particular Shallows, who's has garnered many awards, and is really considered one of the foremost thinkers in the world about how information and information access is changing our lives. So welcome. Here at the Center for Digital Strategies, we think about how changes in the digital world affects how we do business. First, could you give us a little bit of a sense of your overall view of how the information explosion and our ability to access is changing? It's changing how we think about things and how people think, and then how that affects business.
One thing that's happened is that computer technology, at least since the origin of the World Wide Web, but even more intensely, more recently with the spread of smartphones and tablets, has kind of infused itself into our day-to-day life in a way that I think is unprecedented in the history of technology. I mean, we've never interacted with a media technology the way we interact with the online world through our smartphones and computers and so forth. And that's true not only when we're on the job, but when we're off the job as well. And, my original writing was more focused on economic and managerial implications of information technology. And I became interested in the last few years with the question of how does this constant interaction with the online world, with streams of information, how does that influence the way we think, in the way we perceive the world? And I think there's a trade-off that's going on. On the one hand, we get all the benefits of having instant access to incredible amounts of information, to extraordinarily powerful communication tools. We can connect with colleagues or friends or family all the time in a way that was difficult. But I think there's something that's lost along the way. And what's lost is having time available to actually concentrate your mind on one thing, on one hard problem, one conversation, one book, kind of anything where you have to be attentive and screen out interruptions and distractions. So we've created this technology, this very powerful technology that unfortunately I think has the side effect of kind of keeping us in this permanent state of distraction and interruption, multitasking. And there's much that's good with that. But I think that what brain science tells us is that there are important ways of thinking that only happen when you screen out flows of information and actually pay attention. And that's when I think you get conceptual thinking, you get kind of the big picture thinking, you make unexpected connections between far-flung ideas and facts. That only happens when you're kind of have a calm mind, focused, attentive, and we're kind of stealing from ourselves opportunities to practice those attentive ways of thinking. And as a result, I fear, whether it's at work or at home or at play or whatever, you lose something important about your potential as a thinker when you're always processing flows of information and are never kind of alone with your thoughts.
Okay. So if that's how things are going, how does that change what we think about and how we manage organizations? If the interaction of managers and workers in organizations are, I don't want to say distracted, but multitasking.
Yeah.
How does that change the way organizations have to act and manage?
I think the first question is, does the organization simply adapt to these changes in the way people are processing information, the way they're connected all the time, and reform itself on the assumption that people are going to be distracted and interrupted and processing messages all the time? Or do organizations push back a little bit against that trend and actually set up some processes, some procedures that encourage people, when they're engaged in certain kind of tasks where you want conceptual thinking and creative thinking, encourage people to kind of turn off the technology for a while. And And to me, I would actually argue it's important for businesses and other organizations to think about that latter course, not to say let's work on the assumption that people are going to be constantly multitasking, constantly distracted. Instead, let's see if we can shape some of our processes to encourage attentive thinking. Because up until now, I think a lot of businesses have gone on the assumption that the more information, the better, under any circumstance. Right. And so we're going to do whatever we can to optimize the flow of information throughout the organization, to connect, our own systems with the net, bring in social media type things, and it's all that the whole focus is on the more and the faster the information that comes into the organization, the better. And I think you can understand why, that's been the assumption, because in the past, the constraint on the flow of information was an impediment to organizations. But I do think that there's a mistake going on, and that is that businesses often lose sight of the fact that there are some people in some jobs doing certain things where actually their performance would be better if they weren't interrupted. If there wasn't the expectation, and this is an expectation that's prominent in many businesses, that you're constantly monitoring messages, constantly monitoring email, texts, all the various ways we communicate today. And businesses send out signals that really you're expected to constantly be in touch, constantly monitoring. And, if you don't respond immediately, people start to think, what's going on with this person. And so to me, I think it makes sense for businesses to stop and say, are there some circumstances where we want to encourage kind of long-term thinking, deep thinking, conceptual thinking, critical thinking? Should we send out signals that it's okay to disconnect for a while if you're in one of these tasks, in one of these jobs? And my hope is that more and more companies will take that kind of more nuanced view, that there are different flows of information that make sense for different jobs and for different people.
That's interesting. I think you do see companies saying things like, you can't bring electronic devices to meetings, for example. But it is such a big pushback, given that often companies have been successful because of their ability to access information or resources in general, right? The history of kind of U.S. businesses is the more resources you get, the better. And information is a resource. Yeah. So the companies that were able to kind of gather more information did better. And so this idea of limiting that turning that spigot off a little bit, or at least turning it down, is foreign to a lot of companies. Where does things like, when I think about what companies are doing, bring your own device, privacy, security, how does that play into this?
There's these kind of issues about cognition and different ways of thinking. And then there are all sorts of technological issues that arise when, suddenly control is removed from the traditional information technology department, traditional gatekeepers of information and of software and of devices. And it seems to me that, that change has already happened, that people come into the workforce these days expecting to have a great deal of freedom in the information sources they can tap into, the devices they can use. And it's very, very difficult to kind of try to stop that tide. So, but on the other hand, businesses have certain very important legal and other things they have to worry about when it comes to privacy, when it comes to sharing information. And so it's this fine line that companies, particularly companies that are dealing with sensitive customer information in other types of information, is this fine line that you have to walk between control and freedom of the employee. But I think in general the trend has been very strongly and will continue to be toward giving people more choice, and in some cases that means placing more trust in people and taking on the risk that always goes with that, but it's often worth it.
I mean, speaking of issues around trust, so what do you see the impact of having these dominant players around information, the Google, the Facebook, and I think even Zuckerberg talked about that they're going to be the ones to open up internet access around the world. What's the implication of having sort of these, you talk about sort of information access and how it affects how we do business and how we think. What is about when these massive amounts of information are guided very heavily by one or two or three players? How does that play into that?
It's disappointing to me because a number of years ago, I started writing about cloud computing, and I wrote a book. This was back in 2008 called The Big Switch, which was about it was kind of before people really started using the phrase cloud and cloud computing, but it was about that. In my own feeling was that this would kind of revolutionize information, the way you access and use information technology in companies, in that, companies were kind of at that point locked into the client server mode of information technology. And that meant they were locked into, Oracle software and SAP software, and they were locked into relationships with IBM and Microsoft. And it was kind of, I saw cloud computing as a way that you could kind of break out of those, what were kind of, in the worst cases, kind of straitjackets, because it made it very, very hard to change your software, change your information technology strategy. And so I thought cloud computing, and as everything moves onto the internet, would open up lots of new competition for suppliers of software, suppliers of computing power, storage capacity. And what we've seen, as you said, is that actually we've gone from these kind of big, powerful one set of big, powerful suppliers to this other set of big, powerful suppliers. And I do think, and of course, that what's changed is that this is now affects our individual personal information and data, as well as what goes on within businesses. And so I think, obviously Facebook, Twitter, Google, these have been great innovators in social media, in cloud computing and so forth, Amazon as well. But, there's always the danger when you get such a consolidation in the supply base that eventually it begins to restrain innovation, and kind of the new small players don't really have a chance. And so I fear that we may see something like that begin to play out. So beyond the questions of, the very important questions of what does it mean to have so much personal information in the hands of, a few small centralized companies that are very powerful, there is the long run question of, are we creating this kind of new infrastructure for computing that's so centralized and so dominated by giant corporations that eventually we're going to squelch some of the innovation you want to see, both in business computing and in personal computing.
It used to be we had, the newspaper, the middle of the road Walter Cronkite, right? So we had the middle of the road. And so even on diverging issues, there tended to always be this middle view that sort of tempered things. But now if you have very differing views, because of the access to information, you never have to have a dialogue with anybody else. So you can watch a certain news program and only get that news, or you can watch another set of news programs and only get that news. And so there's some worry that in fact we become, not only is it distracted and skimmers, but that we become much more, given the level of access, we become much more sort of dogmatic in our views and less able to converse and have a dialogue.
Right. And I think we do see that. We see this polarization. And this is something that's been going on, since before the internet, with talk radio and with cable news that increasingly, tries to appeal to a particular point of view. But again, this is an example of another example of how when you open up the floodgates of information, you don't necessarily get the effects you would expect. And so when the web was new and people started going online, one of the hopes was that suddenly, we'd expand our horizons and we'd suddenly have access to all these different points of view, and we'd explore, the opinions of people who didn't agree with us. And what's happened is the opposite in many cases, that and we should have probably foreseen this, because it's kind of a flaw in human beings' makeup is that we gravitate toward those people and those views that reinforce our pre-existing opinions and pre-existing biases. And so you're absolutely right that in many cases, what we've seen is you give people unlimited amounts of information and they just go in the one direction. They just seek out that information that reinforces their previous thinking. And, one thing that the science of this kind of information flow makes clear is that when that happens and people are just expose themselves to the points of view that essentially mimic their own, those points of view become more and more extreme over time, because you start to you get so much information that confirms your bias that you say, any other point of view must be wrong because look, I'm getting all these people are telling me that I'm right. And so you get more extreme views and you get more polarization, between the left and the right or between whatever. And what we've discovered is that's very hard. It's very hard to get people in general to seek out information that opposes what they already believe.
The tendency for us to seek confirming evidence. And when we think about businesses, this concern here is that businesses, in fact, will have that same tendency, and thus will make decisions and tie themselves to strategies in a way that sort of sets them on the road to ruin. So, so the fear is you're going to see more big failures because of companies will continue to seek confirming evidence. And you can even argue some of the financial crisis was kind of seeking confirming evidence because you have so much information to consume that we'll see more mistakes in that way.
I think that even applies to what's come to be called big data in this, because the assumption is, well, you have all this data, you have these algorithms that can sort through it and find correlations and so forth. It turns out that a lot comes down to the person who's looking at the data, and you can find all sorts of correlations in a big pile of data, and not all of them are actually. Some of them are just coincidental, or some of them will lead you in the wrong direction. So on the one hand, I think big data kind of analytics offers the opportunity to get some more objective feedback on your strategy, on your positioning or whatever, but it doesn't guarantee that. You can also, even looking at enormous pools of data, you can look at it in a biased way, and even that, you'll pull out the information that confirms your existing point of view about the market or whatever.
Tarai, so we're at the Tuck School. If you're going to give advice to our graduating students, what advice would you give them around these issues?
The most important thing I'd say is that I think now that we all kind of carry smartphones and other constantly connected devices, powerful computers around in our pocket or our pocketbook or whatever, it's more important than ever to be conscious, to be aware of how the technology influences the way we think, the way we perceive things, the way we interact with other people. It becomes very easy when technology kind of gets a lot of momentum and becomes so dominant to simply say, this is just how I live, this is how other people live, and kind of allow the technology to become invisible. And there's a lot of big technology companies that really want the technology to become invisible, because once it becomes invisible, then you use it without thinking about it, which is their ideal. But I do think it's important just to be aware of how this is influencing you. And once you do that, I think you begin to realize that, in a lot of circumstances, whether it's at work or in your social life, it's great to have tons of information at your fingertips. And you want to have that stimulation of being able to exchange messages with other people all the time. But then there are also times when, if you want to, think in certain creative ways or big picture ways, it makes sense to slow down the flow of information, or even to stop it and say, I'm going to back away from this and actually listen to my own thoughts for a while without being interrupted. And so I think by kind of challenging yourself to think critically about your use of technology, you'll ultimately be able to have a a more balanced life and a better balance in the ways you use your mind, the ways you interact with other people, rather than just going kind of in the direction that the technology tends to push us.
Now, I think I know your answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So what do you think of wearable tech?
I'm very nervous about it. For a couple of reasons. One is some of the privacy issues that go with, having Google Glass with a camera readily available all the time. But also because, for two other reasons. One is that you get on the path to being tracked, having information, having data gathered about your behavior at an even more, detailed level. Suddenly Google, and this might be an exaggeration, but it's certainly possible, suddenly Google knows where you are and it knows what you're looking at because it has this feed of data from a wearable computer. And that becomes, ultimately we have to worry about the possibility of being manipulated because companies know, or governments or whatever, know so precisely what we're doing all the time that they can begin to feed us messages or feed us information that ultimately does become manipulative. And then my other concern is simply, the further acceleration or amplification of this culture of distraction, in that you can't experience a conversation or you can't experience the natural world or cultural world without it being mediated by streams of information supplied by algorithms and software.
What advice would you give parents given what you see about raising their kids?
Well, it's as parents know, it's tough. And I've been asked that question, fairly frequently. And what's amazing is just over the last few years, kind of the parameters of the answer have changed dramatically. Because it used to be, it wasn't that long ago, it was, should I get allow my high school student to have a cell phone?
Right.
And now it's, should I allow my, middle schooler to have a smartphone, or should I give my, fourth grader a phone and stuff? And so the technology has kind of dramatically pushed earlier and earlier into kids' lives. And we're seeing schools as well, even, not just high schools and not just middle schools, but elementary schools kind of push iPads, tablets, iPod touches, and so forth onto students at very young ages. And this is a reflection, I think, of the touchscreen interface, which suddenly opens up. You suddenly don't have to have keyboarding skills or anything. So young kids can start to interact with computers for all sorts of purposes. And I think there's a danger that one thing we know, particularly about younger kids, is that to develop into interesting, well-rounded adults, you want to have young kids have all sorts of different kinds of experiences and interact with the world in many different ways through their senses, explore with their hands, and I think you want that to happen at home, and you also want it to happen in schools. And what we're doing is we're taking the computer screen, which kids already use a lot, whether it's for TV or texting or whatever, and we're saying spend more time looking at a computer screen. And it strikes me that goes against the fundamental and long-standing conclusions of developmental psychologists, that you don't want to narrow kids down to interacting with the world through a screen, through one medium. So I would, to parents, I would encourage, and I know this is tough because if the more kind of society says, well, 6-year-olds should have smartphones or something, the harder it becomes for anybody to resist. But I do think that you have to keep in mind whether you're trying to influence the school your kids go to, or whether you're organizing, helping to organize their lives at home, that you don't want to just let them drift into spending more and more time on screens. You want to make sure they have diverse experiences, learning experiences, other experiences. And that's the kind of best way, as I said, to get healthy, well-rounded, curious, involved young adults and ultimately adults.
So you've given advice to parents, you've given advice to our students. Now, let's say you had a ballroom full of all of the CEOs in the world, and that you were going to give them advice that would influence them, that you were the grand wizard here. What would that advice be?
Over the last year, I've been doing a lot of research on automation, the use of computers to take over work that people used to do. And this is, as you know, a huge trend in the industrial world, in the white collar world increasingly. And there's this big push, I think, to take all sorts of different jobs that used to be done in different ways and to kind of automate them with, powerful software, with algorithms. And I would urge, and what's pushing this a lot is because you often get higher efficiency. You don't have to hire as many workers. And in some cases, that's well and good. And you can certainly see why businesses are gung-ho in many cases about automation. But I think when you begin to dig into it, you see that there again are some big drawbacks. That there are skill sets that you get when you let people do work and let people struggle with whether it's what we call knowledge work or whether it's manual work or whatever. There's still things that people can discover and people can do that computers aren't able to replicate. And so what happens, I think, if you push decision support type software, kind of the next wave of sort of, the IBM Watson type model, right, of let's start to move decision making and judgment making into the computer and away from people. I think you can do that in the computer. Might be faster, will probably be faster, but there are still subtle insights that come with allowing people to really grapple with hard problems without reverting to very fast computers that can often lead to really breakthrough type ideas and thoughts. And so I would, we're at the stage, I think, where we're going to see this acceleration of automation throughout all layers of companies. And I would encourage caution on the part of CEOs to not think that every job and every employee is replaceable by software, that you want to keep the human factor involved in your business in lots of different ways.
Do you worry that people are going to view you as just a grumpy Luddite who's kind of railing against, technologies? Does that worry you at all?
This is the time when we really need to think more critically than ever. And so, I'm completely comfortable using computers. I do a lot of my research, through Google, through the web. Have been a long time user of computers, but at the same time, I'm going to allow I'm not going to turn off the critical functions of my brain, even if it means somebody calling me a Luddite once in a while.
I think the idea of not falling into the trap that thinking more information is always better is an amazing lesson that everyone should listen to, from raising your kids to running a company. And I think if that gets through, then I think you've done the world a great service. So
thank you.
On behalf of the Center for Digital Strategies, I want to thank you very much for spending time with us.
My pleasure.
And good luck.
Thank you.